Okay, class, so we're back for the second half of Dada. And whereas we began in Zurich, where Dada really begins, and the works and the strategies are a bit more irreverent, even though they're a response to some serious issues, especially the war. We now move on to Berlin, just immediately after the war, where things get much more confrontational and much more political. So you think about it. If you're an artist in Switzerland during the war, it's a neutral country. What you're doing, you're slightly more free in what you do, and maybe there are less consequences with what you do. If you're living in Berlin in 1918, 1919, 1920, 1921, and the beginnings of the Weimar period, not only are your living conditions completely different, we'll talk about this when we get to new objectivity, Neusachlichkeit, and the nightmare that was the Weimar Republic, which ultimately led to the Nazis taking over. You were also living in a time where there was repression, and there was censorship of the arts and of free thought, and of political ideologies that maybe were not looked favorably upon by those in power and by the elite. So we moved to Berlin with that as a backdrop, and when we talk about Berlin Dada, there's a really seminal moment, a really important moment, which is the first International Dada Fair from 1920. And so here you're seeing an installation shot of it. And all these Dada artists, Raoul Hausmann, Husenbeck, Hannah Hawk, George Grosz, John Hartfield, who we'll end up talking about a little later in the semester, they actually all got together and they invited a professional photographer of the time to document this exhibition of theirs. But it's a peculiar exhibition in a number of ways. So one, in the name, First International Dada Fair. You don't normally think of an exhibition of art as a fair, which usually has, let's say, at least two connotations. One of like the carnivalesque, of kind of a circus, like a fair, Ferris wheels and what are those things, elephant ears or cotton candy. And the other thing you think of is a place where people go and buy and sell things, a convention or a fair, that sort of thing. And so they were being cheeky. They were identifying with these connotations of the fair as both the place that would be sort of this carnivalesque atmosphere, which is kind of making fun of art as this pretentious elite bourgeois thing, and also underscoring the fact, again in a mocking satirical way, that art is simply a commodity to be bought and sold, an idea that a lot of people would definitely have resisted back then, and continue to resist. If you go to Chelsea, one day again, hopefully we'll be able to visit Chelsea and see some contemporary art. If you go there, you'll see galleries with works on the wall or in the space, but rarely, if ever, will you see a price tag. And that's intentional. They want to give the sense that this is a rarefied space of a gallery of art, something akin to a museum. But of course, if you're well off enough, you can go talk to the gallerist, take out your checkbook, and go home with the work that you liked, at least eventually. So there is a commercial quality, there is a commercial foundation to art, at least going back quite some time, but it's definitely in the later 19th century, especially with Impressionism, where this gallery system really starts to consolidate and form. So here they're making fun of two things. The bourgeois gallery as this very rarefied space. They're treating it like a circus. And also this place that normally should be outside of the economy, where you're just dealing with ideas and beauty and noble stuff, right? They're also making fun of that by treating it as simply like a fair, with advertising, with text, a lot of it quite nonsensical or contradictory, which is quite Dada. All of these are consolidated in this show. So this gets back to the idea of Dada as a movement that wanted to mock, that was really trying to go against conventional culture, especially bourgeois culture, which again they deemed to be complicit with the military class for all the destruction in Europe. So when you're seeing this installation shot, one thing that stands out, well, you have these paintings. This is by Otto Dix. This is by George Grosz. These are artists we're going to end up talking about a little bit more, both this class and then later in a few classes. But one of the things that really stands out is this dummy up here, which is suspended on the wall. I think you can tell it's a military uniform, World War I German military uniform. And maybe it's hard to tell, but he has a pig face. So this is a work by George Grosz, and it's clearly making fun of the military. And he got the show. He got into quite some trouble because of this dummy. And there was another part of the show that he got into even more trouble with, and that would have been this collection of drawings that outside the space I just showed you, he would have been selling. So you'd be able to go and buy drawings. If you were part of the public back then, although it's well known that they actually lost quite a bit of money on this show. They weren't able to recoup their money. Only one work was sold or something like this. So with Dada, there's always this irony floating around. In any case, here's George Grosz's God With Us from 1919, which he publishes in 1920, and this is part of the first International Dada Fair, and it would have been on sale in the back. And once again, he's clearly making fun of the military class here. Look at this general with this his helmet and his lapel, and then the reference to God with us. So this is mocking. And if I can make a plug in the history of music, definitely go back and listen to Bob Dylan's "God on Our Side." It's an incredible song. And the sentiment is quite similar. Grosz is making fun of this military that's led with these sort of bloodthirsty nationalistic desires to war and devastation and destruction and so on and so forth. But of course, the military in some ways he's depicting as if they're fine with it because God is on their side, right? They know that they're in the right, which of course all sides are usually able to invoke. So he's clearly satirizing the military class here, and at the level of the aesthetic, the form, this is also a complete scrambling of codes. So this is George Grosz. This is deemed to be, this is Dada. This is now, I guess, in some ways, a part of the art history canon. But notice how he is tapping into lower forms of art. This is definitely more something you'd see in a newspaper or a satirical net magazine, something more like political caricature. Drawings that are making fun of contemporary people, contemporary politicians, and that sort of thing. We're going to see that a lot in Dada, and so he's collapsing. He's in this avant-garde movement. He's playing with and he's dabbling with popular forms of culture, not unlike Cubism. Remember Apollinaire and Picasso, the idea that now artists could use everyday materials, but there it's more for like poetic ends, and it's more for formal experimentation and aesthetics. Here Grosz is picking up and taking on something from lower popular culture, not for form, but for weaponry, really, as criticism and as satire and as parody. So he actually got arrested for this, and had to pay quite a fine, got in a lot of trouble. And you'd think, well, this cover, how are you going to get into lots of trouble with this? It's some of the drawings inside that were more worrisome for those that were in power. So I've only picked one. Grosz is really a lot of fun, and once you know his style, there's no going back. You'll know what a George Grosz is, and he was pretty prolific. So you can go on the MoMA website and look. They have this whole portfolio. I think there are 9 different drawings in this portfolio, and they have all of them there, so take a look at all of them. This one is called Blood is the Best Sauce. And of course, the tone, the register of this is once again ironic and satirical and pretty scathing. So in the background, you have soldiers fighting each other, but it looks like also killing civilians. So one thing you need to know about 1919 and 1920 in Germany is that after the war, there was a moment where there were competing political factions in the country. And so there were some on the left, inspired by the Russian Revolution, who thought, hey, the Kaiser is gone. Now we can have a new political system. Let's go to a political system where everybody is treated more equally. Let's go for communism. Rosa Luxemburg would be probably the most important figure of these ideas at the time. And there was a revolution, or at least a rebellion, led by Rosa Luxemburg, which was then violently put down. They were in fact killed, right? And then you have the Weimar Republic that comes in the wake of that. And so George Grosz is likely referencing this brutal repression of ideas that don't fit with elites in power who are backed by the military. So you have the military, you have this violence, and then you have these two older guys in the front. One is a very, let's say, gluttonous bourgeois with his monocle, eating a steak or something. And then to his right, he's eating with this very elderly general, right? So Grosz is showing this complicity and this pact between the upper crust, the elite in society, and military power and the police state. And then if it's not even more clear, the title itself makes it all that more clear. Blood is the best sauce. So mixing gastronomic and warlike sentiments all in one drawing. So I think with this one you can see why Grosz got into trouble. We're not at a point in Germany where you can make whatever you want. There will be repression, there will be censorship, and this was an example of that. So another work that was in the International Dada Fair, studying, we're by and large staying with the International Dada Fair with this section of Berlin Dada, though by no means is this all the works and all the artists that are involved. This is just an introduction. But within this space, you also had a work by Johannes Baader, who was a pretty wild character, a little bit like the futurist. He would go out and do things in public. At one point, he got up during a mass, during a church, and started yelling and telling the priest and everybody there that they didn't deserve religion, they didn't deserve Christ, they didn't deserve the New Testament, and very incendiary stuff, very confrontational instigation. There was another Dadaist, this is not Baader, but one who got up in the middle of a performance, a theater performance, and said he was going to shoot everybody. So this would be an impossible thing for an artist to do today, especially with the gun pandemic that we have in this country. But however unimaginable it is, these are some of the things that the Dada artists did to really instigate society in almost in a violent way, or at least with pseudo threats of violence as these aesthetic instigations. So Johannes Baader was definitely one of these artists who was then diagnosed as basically manic depressive. So this is tricky when you're talking about an artist who may very well have had mental health issues. It's difficult in some ways to sort of not so much interpret, but we have to be somewhat delicate when we're talking about someone's life in this way. One of the other things that he did as a Dadaist is run for public office. At one point, he even says he's going to run for president, even president of the world. So there's almost like this megalomaniac kind of quality, which you see a little bit in this work, which is the great Plasto Dio Dada drama, Germany's Greatness and Decline, or the Fantastic Life of the Super Dada. In Dada, a lot of the titles are long and grandiose, but also silly, but self-mocking. Like they're making fun of titling artworks. These are all very cheeky titles. This isn't the first one you're going to see, but it's basically this monument to the New Age. And remember, I said this at the beginning. of the first session, I believe that the 1910s into the 20s in Europe marks the moment where you have an acceleration of technology and newer technologies, that now there's an explosion in the public sphere, in the public media, of text and especially of images. And so this is almost a monument to this new public sphere, which in some ways he's also mocking, he's also making fun of. This looks a little bit like, if you know Thomas Hirschhorn, a contemporary Swiss artist who makes these kind of monuments. This is not the kind of monument you would ever expect to see in 1920, especially after the war. You would expect to see a war monument of some kind. But here you're getting newspapers, you're getting technology, you're getting a dummy, you're getting all this cacophonous text and newspapers. So there was something satirical and mocking about this work too. And it's usually credited to be one of the first, let's say, installation works. Installation works that in the 60s and 70s definitely start to become commonplace as a new language in art. But this is so new. No one would have taken this seriously as a work of art in 1920. But it's not just this silly explosion and this mocking monument to the new press and the new public media sphere. It's also a challenge to it. So this is one of the things that Dada did really well. They understood how important it was after the war to shift the terrain away from, refined individual objects like paintings that try to communicate something. They understood they had to shift the terrain and meet head on this changing world. If the Dadaists were nothing else, they were plunging headlong into what they considered to be a new reality, not escaping from it like the German Expressionists, who they accused of escapism, but they wanted to plunge head on into this new socio-political world that they found themselves in. And so this is a really important idea for Dada. They wanted to shift the terrain and make it clear that this new public sphere, this saturation of media and images, is not some neutral thing. This is an information scape, a network that actually plays a part in the democratic process, that plays a part in citizenry, that plays a part in the nation, and that plays a part in public opinion and public discourse. So they understood this. They understood that that the media was very, very important at the level of ideas and at the level of visual culture. And I think they're if they were alive today, their mouths would drop wide open, their tongues would hang out, and they wouldn't be able to believe the internet, and they wouldn't be able to believe the way in which our information scape has altered the world, and the way in which now we have to be really vigilant in understanding, one, how the media forms us as subjects, as citizens, the opinions we hold. But not only that, we have to be vigilant, extra vigilant, in knowing when something is close to the truth and when something is a total fabrication and maybe a process of manipulation, right? Either directly on you or on a citizenry, on an election, so on and so forth, right? So these are ideas that are big for us, right? Think of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which very likely played a big role in the 2016 election. This is something that Dadaists would have understood. But I think they would have thought, man, they wouldn't even have thought that it would get this far, right? For them, they're dealing with newspaper print and black and white photographs, right? But they understood that this was an important terrain, a new space of political resistance that art, that aesthetics could enter into, which is so different from painting and sculpture, right? And one of the artists who did this beautifully and very famously, this is probably the most famous work of Berlin Dada, is Hannah Höch, which you can just call Cut with the Kitchen Knife, because the full title is a real mouthful. But it's Cut with the Kitchen Knife, Dada through the Weimar beer belly cultural epoch of Germany. Sorry. A very, very long title. A very funny title. Again, like the great Plasto Dada drama, this is mocking of our titles, but also a self-mockery. There's a wonderful way in which Dada, if it criticized other artists, it also criticized itself. Like there was a built-in self-reflexive mechanism in Dada that they would also be self-mocking, and they would make sure not to arrive at positions, even like secure positions, that they would accuse other artists or thinkers of settling into. So Hannah Höch's Cut with the Kitchen Knife is one of those works that really does what I just explained really well. She takes images from this new visual commodity culture, this new media, along with text, but she scrambles it all together. She uses it, but in order to subvert it in certain ways. She takes familiar people and familiar tropes and familiar images. By and large, these are politicians and artists. There's a very famous dancer who was one of the most famous dancers at the time. She's in the center. And then there's also other famous public figures. And then there's a lot of imagery of machinery. I had one student long ago, well, not long ago, but a few years ago, describe this as steampunk, and I kind of like that description, because there is something steampunk about this. All these gears, all these wheels, all these engines, making the whole thing kind of go, right? But in this rather disorganized way, in this cacophonous way, not in this ordered way. And so she's making you, as a viewer, especially if you're living in 1919, 1920, when all these things are so new, there's a way in which when you see a scrambling of the news like this, that you realize, oh, well, it can be different. Like there's a way in which she shows you that the news you're getting and the public discourse that's based off of this media system is in many ways a constructed one that's quote unquote curated for the public. And so to use it, splice it up and mix it up and show and do different things with it, there's a way in which it sort of opens up different possibilities. At least that's the idea behind this kind of work. And this is a photomontage. So it's a type of collage, but that uses photography, right? From this new information scape and this explosion of visual culture in the 1920s, especially in Germany. And there were all these debates as to which Dada invented photomontage. But it turns out that actually photomontage was probably invented as not by artists, but just by everyday people. So there's a story that Hannah Höch was on vacation, and she saw someone with a postcard where a face had been inserted into the postcard, like a face of a family member, and that generated the idea for this. And this is something that troops during the war would also do. There would be postcards where you'd have images that are spliced into the postcard. So very likely as a technique, photomontage was first a popular thing. And then Dada and a number of different Dada artists took it up as a medium that fit well with their program. So it's a very complex work, as you can see. But let's go in and pick out some of the themes before moving forward. So she's making fun of political art. Making fun of art as a commercial thing, which is very Dada. So making fun of this bourgeois conception of art as rarefied and valuable and so on and so forth. At some point, it's all in German, right? So I've translated it for you. So invest your money in Dada. I don't think, today it's commonplace for very wealthy people to think of art as an investment. And it's definitely an investment. But back then, no, not yet. This would not be something that would be admitted to. But then at another point, it says Dada is not an art trend, which is so funny because you'd think that being trendy and being an investment would go together, but they don't. At least in the mind of Dada, they like to play with contradiction. You'll see Dada and then anti-Dada. There's a famous line where I think it's Hulsenbeck who says Dada is anti-Dada. So it's almost like they couldn't make positive statements. Like they wanted to constantly be subversive and anarchic, even at the level of meaning and contradiction. And so you see that here as an example of making fun of commercial art. And then the imagery is also, I mean, it's kind of funny. Do you can recognize who this is? I think he's more famous when you see him as older, with the white mustache and the big white hair. But that's Einstein. That's Einstein. And coming out of his head is this ant-like insect. And so she's combined really strange, incongruous images together. On top of his head is this machine, right? And you have the legs of a worker hanging off. It's just this incongruous visual jumble. And maybe using the language of this new mediascape, which would have been, for people back then, we're used to seeing images everywhere all the time. We're saturated and flooded with images, memes and videos and all sorts of things, right? But this would be a new historical vision. Like this would be a new way of seeing the world, which might have been overwhelming for people. Sometimes it's overwhelming for me, especially being online and just being flooded with media. It can be disorienting. And so it's as if she's trying to induce this through her photomontage, right? Making fun of political figures, that's a key thing in Dada. This is General von Hindenburg. His head, anyways, that she's put on the body of a belly dancer. And notice the belly dancer is kind of straddling this wheel. A lot of people have noted that in Cut with a Kitchen Knife, this photomontage, that if this reflects society in any ways, it's the female body, it's the female form, the female figures, and personages in this photomontage that seem to be making the wheels and the gears move. It's actually not the men. And that might make a lot of sense for two reasons. One, if you think about it, you have 15 million people killed, or I think the numbers are higher than that in World War I. In Germany, it was especially bad, and you have a whole generation of men that are gone, right? A whole generation of men that are gone, which in the space of the economy and of working life, this allowed and actually necessitated women to go into work, right? Women to start working. And it's in the 1920s where you start to gain this. There is this visibility of what was called the new woman, who usually had like close crop hair, and looked like she was in control and in business and in work. This was a new idea. And a new figure that was emerging in German society and in Europe as a whole. And so maybe Hannah Höch is referencing this by making the women really literally in the photomontage the gears of society, making the gears of society go. So maybe it's not a coincidence that General von Hindenburg, who was largely deemed responsible for all this death and carnage in World War I, that he's been replaced with a female form, a belly dancer, which of course is not unproblematic from a feminist perspective today, but it is the female form that's making this wheel move. You also have Kaiser Wilhelm, so the Kaiser, basically the king, the emperor of Germany during World War I. He's made fun of here. He has his top hat. His mustache is made of two upside down guys who are wrestling. One of his eyes is like a sardine can. So again, this juxtaposition of really crazy images all together. And if there was one figure who was most reviled, it was probably the Kaiser, who was after the loss of World War I and basically allowing Germany to enter into war. He was most widely ridiculed. So Dada is definitely doing that. And you also have a nice, there's a lot more in this. So if you're interested in this work, just go read a little bit more on it, because it's a very rich work and there's a lot of great texts and even videos online that talk more about it if we had more time. But I do want to point out one moment down here where she's included a map. And this is where we get to the idea that for a long time it was thought that Dada was just kind of nihilistic, that it never really had a stance, that it was just politically anarchic, that it was just trying to assault things but never wanted to really assert anything in itself other than this nihilistic anarchy. And I think hopefully over the course of today I've sort of debunked that. So I think we can understand why people would have thought that about Dada, but there was definitely a method to their madness, right? And here's one where it's almost like a clear indication that Hannah Höch is giving us... Oh, sorry, that was my doc. The doc on my computer. There's a clear indication that Hannah Höch is making a statement here about women's suffrage, about the right to vote. So in 1920, unlike today, not all of Europe had the vote. And so she has a map, a current map from then, 1920, that shows you which countries have the vote for women and which countries do not have the vote, right? So this is as direct as it gets, and this is in a work of Dada, so it's very, very interesting. Okay, so side by side, if we put the photomontage next to one of the papier-collés from Picasso, you see where we might say there are some similarities, because both of these works are using what were then deemed to be non-art objects, right? It's not paint, it's not marble, it's not drawing, it's not a print. They're using just objects from everyday life. One is using photographs from this new media, and Picasso was using wallpaper grain and newspapers and colored paper and that sort of thing. But it's very, very clear, unless you ascribe to the interpretation of Picasso as somehow politically committed through these papier-collés, which if there is, if you are sold by that argument, which it's possible, it would still be like coded, right? If you're going to make a political claim, usually what you want to do is be clear. If you're able to, right? If you don't live in a repressive state, you can be pretty clear about your demands and your opinions and your thoughts, right? These papier-collés are not that at all, right? So it's just in there, it's coded, whereas in Hannah Höch's work, it's just an explosion. Even though it's this cacophony, in many ways it's clear what she's ridiculing and what she's making fun of, and how she conceives of this new world that she finds herself in, along with her fellow Dada artists. I also wanted to bring in a work by Kurt Schwitters, who's not Berlin Dada, but he is in Hanover, and he would have been influential. And Kurt Schwitters is really interesting because he makes these works called Merz paintings, Merz pictures. He actually, in his home, he makes a whole house that's just filled with this clutter. He's one of the first artists who will make work. He goes even further in some ways than using the visual culture. He's using anything. He's using like stuff in trash, the detritus of everyday life here. This is a pretty famous one. It's at MoMA, the cherry picture from 1921. So it's labels, it's advertising, it's newspaper, it's cloth, it's all these different materials that are put together, and not in a way, like if you look at Picasso, there's something really quite beautiful. This is of course subjective, but a lot of people find the papier-collé to be very lovely, formal experimentations that are quite nice to look at. Schwitters is showing you just the griminess of everyday life through his work. So this is almost a type of accumulation work, or if you know Robert Rauschenberg, who you'll study if you study the post-war period in the United States in the 50s and 60s, these kind of these paintings, hybrid sculptures that are almost like an accumulation of trash. So this is not a form of really sublimation, of taking like gross things and making them beautiful. It's actually just presenting the the harsh reality of everyday materials on the picture plane. So Schwitters is interesting to bring in here. And then the last work we talk about is by Raoul Hausmann. This is the other really famous work that was in the first International Dada Fair. It's called Mechanical Head, Spirit of the Age. And this work, and, well, I shouldn't go back too far, but because you know this now, but the Hannah Höch work, all of these three works, not so much Picasso, but all these three works, in some ways, embrace the very thing that they're against. Like, they use the very thing that they think is wrong. This is a really complex idea or strategy, but this is very Dada, right? So, again, the title is mocking. It's called Mechanical Head, Spirit of the Age. Basically, you have this haberdashery dummy, like a dummy that would have a hat on it, that would be used in a store. So right off the bat, this art object is identical with a store object, right? Something that would be in a commercial store. And this poor guy, he has a wallet that's kind of stapled to one side of the head, and the other side of the head is affixed this ruler. He has a tape measure coming down the front of his head on his forehead. He's like affixed with a number. He has like a thimble on top there. So he has all these utilitarian objects. All of these objects either have to do with money or measurement, right? And you get a conception of the spirit of the age as humanity just now completely tethered and tied to material concerns of measurement, of science, of the economy, and in some ways really kind of constrained by this. And I don't know what sense you get of this dummy, but there's also a sense of a cog in a machine kind of vibe here, right? Where you know that this dummy was made in a factory at somewhere at the time, and there are tons of these in all sorts of stores, and they're basically identical. So also there's this idea of the mechanical head as not only being made uninteresting and subsumed into this materialistic age, but also everybody is more or less the same, right? This fear that we're all consuming the same things, we're all reading the same things, we're all buying the same things, and then we're all turning into identical pods, right? This idea that's been a horror for most people on the left, especially in critical theory in the 20th century. We're seeing it here in Hausmann's Mechanical Head, Spirit of the Age. And I usually joke in class that you could just throw in an iPhone, and like a glowing iPhone in front of this guy's head, and you'd basically have what we have. everybody on their phones. But actually, after this pandemic, maybe that's going to change. People will look up at each other again. So let's just finish with this really wonderful quote by Peter Sloterdijk and Richard Holzenbeck. So Richard Holzenbeck is he was called the Dada philosopher. Each Dada had their own name. Baader, Johannes Baader, he was Super Dada. All the Dadas had their own nickname with Dada as the postfix. Holzenbeck was the Dada philosopher. And he makes a number of really good statements. He wrote a manifesto, which is, if we had more time, if we were in class together, we would kind of read it together, because it just says a lot about this movement, especially the Berlin Dada. But for now, we just have this one line, but I think it says a lot. I think it says a lot about the tactics and the tone and the register of what Dada was at this time in Berlin. So he says, we were for the war, and today Dadaism is still for war. Things have to collide. Things are not proceeding nearly as horribly as they should. So this is in 1919. And at first you might be scratching your head and you'd say, Professor, why are you showing me this? This sounds like the futurists. This sounds like Holzenbeck is for war. He sounds like an accelerationist who thinks that to get to a better world, everything has to go even worse so that we get there. We just have to accelerate destruction and so on and so forth, right? And I'd say, yeah, I guess you could read it that way if you were reading this as face value. But with Dada, almost everything that we've looked at. And most of what you'll read coming from the Dadaists themselves, you have to take ironically. This is an instance of an artist writing a text where he is saying what he doesn't actually believe. But by doing that, he's showing the absurdity of the thing he doesn't believe in. So to explain this, I bring in Peter Sloterdijk, who's a wonderful, well, he's not without his problems, but a wonderful German philosopher who wrote a book called The Critique of Cynical Reason. And we're going to talk about it again, actually, when we get to New Objectivity. But Sloterdijk explains this tone, this register of Dada, and he says, specifically of Hulsenbeck here, but this will apply to all the works that we saw today, and the mood and the tone of Dada. He says he was trying out the new tactics on an immeasurably ticklish subject, namely the art of declaring oneself in an ironic way, dirty way, to be in agreement with the worst possible things. And so that encapsulates the Dada strategy really well. Hulsenbeck is identifying with, he's saying the thing almost in a deadpan way. He's in agreement with the futurists. He's in agreement with the military class. We have to have war. Things are not bad enough. We gotta keep going in that direction. But by saying it, and to such a degree, he makes it absurd. He's mocking it. And so this gets to one of our key takeaways from Dada. It was, and maybe still is, a strategy whereby an artist embraces the very thing she critiques, thereby exposing its absurdities from the inside. So this is a strategy that's sometimes called over-identification. And there are tons of examples of this, especially even today, like a lot of comics will do this. So Sacha Baron Cohen, you remember the comedian who did that movie called Borat? And more recently he did something, what is it, This Is America, which I actually haven't watched, but I saw some clips. He's a comedian that does this. He'll commit this strategy. He'll do this strategy. He'll become a character to such a degree that he'll tease out the absurdities of contemporary life. Or think of Stephen Colbert before he became the late night show, when it was the Colbert Report. He was, in a very deadpan, seemingly sincere way, he pretended to be a very right-wing, like talking head. But he didn't do it because he believed in those ideas. He did it to show, through parody, through identification, over-identification, how absurd it could sound, how absurd it could be, right? So that's what Dada were doing. Not only in their objects themselves, where they're actually using the very things they're critiquing, right? Hausmann here is not for the spirit of the age. He's not for a mechanical humanity, even though he's showing you this mechanical humanity and using technologies of measurement and money and the economy and that sort of thing. It's the same thing with Hannah Höch, right? She's using the very media and new information landscape against itself, right? And that's this strategy, and it's a really fitting way of describing Dada. So something to think about. One, can you find this strategy in artists or in comedians today? And is it still a sound strategy, or can it be a dangerous strategy? Those are important and interesting questions to pose. Okay, so that's enough for Berlin Dada. We'll end it there. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.